Welcome to the Yale Cyber Leadership Forum. There will be a Q&A session at the end. If you would like to submit a question for the panelists, please do so in the Q&A panel. This session is being recorded. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome virtually to Yale University's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. I'm Ted Wittenstein. This is session number 7 of the Yale Cyber Leadership Forum, Disinformation and Active Measures. We'll introduce our terrific guest in just a moment. As a reminder, all attendees have their volume and video muted. We're eager to incorporate your questions. You can submit those using the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we'll record this session and distribute and post the video afterwards for the benefit of everyone. It's hard to believe that we have reached our 7th and final bi-weekly Thursday webinar focused on the theme of sovereignty in cyberspace, but I think we've saved the best for last. We're really looking forward to the conversation. Under our leadership of Forum Director Ona Hathaway, my colleague and professor at Yale Law School, this has been a virtual tour de force exploring data governance, criminal law enforcement, defending forward, election interference, organization strategy, and cyber diplomacy, to name just a few of the areas we've touched on. And you can catch up on the previous sessions at cyber.forum.yale.edu. Thomas Rid is a professor of strategic studies at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. He previously served as professor of security studies in the Department of War Studies at King's College London, where he developed their cybersecurity program there. And he's the author of Active Measures: The Secret History of Disinformation and Political Warfare, a gripping and highly informative account that we no doubt will delve into today. It's an incredible body of research through declassified CIA records, documents from Moscow's intelligence archives, interviews with serving and retired spies, and traces the roots of political espionage back to the Bolshevik Revolution of the 1920s before moving to the present challenges of headline news. He's a German-born political scientist and a world-renowned expert on information security. He's testified before the US Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, the German Bundestag, and the UK Parliament, to name just a few areas. So we're delighted to have him with us to help us close out the Yale Cyber Leadership Forum. I'm so grateful to the leadership of Ona Hathaway and our partnership in putting this all together. Thank you for moderating. Thomas, thank you for being with us. I'm going to let Ona kick off the discussion. And remember, please submit your questions using the Q&A function in Zoom, which I'll help moderate later in the conversation. So thank you very much, and over to you, Ona.
Thank you so much, Ted. It's so great to be here, and so glad to have all of you with us, and particularly to have Thomas here to talk about active measures. I, of course, have my own copy with its little marks because it's such a great read, and I really highly recommend it to anyone who's interested in these issues. And if you're listening, certainly you are. So Thomas, I wanted to start off by inviting you to just sort of help us understand what we mean when we talk about these terms, disinformation and active measures. You know, the title of your book, of course, is Active Measures, Secret History of Disinformation and Political Warfare. So what are we talking about when we're talking about disinformation? What are we talking about when we're talking about active measures? Why did you title the book Active Measures? Sort of help us understand these terms.
Thank you. And thanks for this overly generous introduction. I can only disappoint moving forward from that. And also apologize for the car setup. I have a bit of a loud household right now and have to escape into quieter situations. Disinformation, specifically disinformation, I think is a term that is by definition imprecise, ambiguous, and to a significant extent actually misleading. So the fact that we call this field, the search field now, disinformation, is really not a very fortunate choice. So why am I calling it active measures in the book? I mean, I'll answer the question historically. In the early 1960s, the different Soviet bloc intelligence or Eastern Bloc intelligence agencies started to use the term active measures. actually in different languages. In German, it was aktive Maßnahmen. And they did that in order to have a more bureaucratically nimble term to use, because disinformation, I don't think I'm reading too much into the sources here, was focusing the mind too much on the distinction between false and true, between accurate and inaccurate, between fact and forgery. And in some ways, that is a counterproductive focus, both for the offense, say for Stasi's external intelligence arm in the 1960s, but also for the defense. Because what this is about what active measures are about is about activating an effect, activating a political and often emotional effect. It's not about lying or saying the truth or a mix of both. It's about achieving an effect here. And I think that just reframes the conversation in a helpful way.
Yeah, that's so interesting. So it's a great point that much of what you describe in the book, and much of what we've seen kind of in recent years has been the most harmful, is not necessarily inaccurate information. Some of it's inaccurate, some of it's accurate. And it strikes me that there's kind of two dimensions of accuracy versus inaccuracy. So there's sometimes it's about getting accurate information and dumping it. So this was the sort of hack of the DNC. You get actual information, you kind of expose it, although it's not entirely clear that all of it is entirely accurate. And so that's, I think, falls within the scope of active measures, even though it's not false, it's actually true. Then there's, of course, there is sometimes false information. I mean, you do have stories in here of actually, faked information, things that are not true. The KGB book, which was retaliation for a similar CIA book. I guess the KGB book was actually mostly true, whereas the book about the CIA released by the Russians was sort of half true, half false. So yeah, say a little bit more about falsehood and truth in this, what role that plays, and how in some ways true information leaked might even be more harmful in some ways, and how that's manipulated in this context.
Yeah, let's use an older example to achieve some emotional distance from the case. And one of my favorite examples is a campaign that's mainly KGB, but with help from other agencies, started in Germany, West Germany in 1959, around Christmas Day. And it was a quote unquote fake anti-Semitic hate campaign. And I say quote unquote fake because yes, the initial anti-Semitic incidents were forged. It was most likely not actual anti-Semites or people who were actually anti-Semitic who scribbled some of these graffitis on synagogues and cemeteries in West Germany, in New York, in London, in Brussels, in many cities across the West in a coordinated fashion. Some of them, may actually have been ideologically motivated, but still instigated and paid by KGB. But what happened next was that actual anti-Semitic incidents followed. What happened next is that actual outrage followed. And let's just state the obvious. This was Germany 14 years after the Holocaust. There was obviously still a problem with anti-Semitism. That was not fake. And what followed is also a genuine and actual concern on the part of allies that West Germany would fall back into its old anti-Semitic ways. So all of these reactions were real and genuine and very meaningful. And the fact that the initial spark had some forgeries in it is almost a distraction, because you can't just say this is all fake. If you just file the whole event as fake, and the German public and the German political leadership at the time very deliberately did not treat this as a foreign interference situation, but as an actual anti-Semitism problem. If you treat it as fake, then you're really missing out. I mean, you're sort of, this is the wrong reaction. If you transform a similar type of dynamic into race relations in the United States today, then you can just see how politically difficult it will become.
So the way you described it, it's a kind of form of a manipulation of kind of cleavages that exist, or sort of knowing kind of these cleavages in society that you might sort of spark. I mean, so it requires a kind of understanding, I guess, of the society and kind of where the pressure points might be, and then kind of pushing on those pressure points to try and get something kind of activated as you're describing it.
Absolutely. So one of the most remarkable discoveries that I made, for me, was a game changer, was I read a dissertation by a German researcher who's now curating the German Spy Museum. Christopher Nehring is his name. And he speaks Bulgarian, and he had done archival research in Bulgaria, in the Bulgarian equivalent to the Stasi archives in Germany, sort of the secret police archives. And Christopher had discovered a lot of KGB documents in these archives about active measures. And so I went and looked at the primary source files and, got myself a Bulgarian translator to check my Google translations. And it was extraordinary to find documents that really spelled out in detail how KGB was engaging in these, how they would, for example, do the proposal process for active measures. And they stressed the cultural experience that their officers needed on the ground. So, you don't have these ideas. You need to find out about those cleavages, those unresolved contradictions, as they called it, in the target society on the ground. And often that involves picking up on conspiracy theories that bubble up in an organic fashion and then amplifying them, which is, for example, what happened with the HIV/AIDS, AIDS made in the USA myth. That was actually an original domestic conspiracy theory that they then amplified.
I love that term, unresolved contradictions. That's sort of this idea that there are these kinds of frictions or problems that kind of existing within society, and you kind of have to discover them in order to kind of exploit them to kind of give them authority and power. That's fascinating. And what's so interesting about your book, for me at least, somebody who's a relatively kind of new to this, to sort of thinking about this field. I mean, a lot of us, I think, really began to think more seriously about it, obviously, after the 2016 election, was just how deep the history is. I mean, the story that you're telling is a story that goes back quite a long ways. Particularly, I mean, your focus is largely on this kind of East-West divide, and particularly for me, what was fascinating was the kind of way in which Russia has been using this technique for decades and decades. And I guess I wanted to ask you a little bit about the kind of symmetry/asymmetry question, because one of your central themes, or one of the arguments that you make, is that kind of early on, the U.S. was right in the game with Russia. So in the, right after World War II, in the mid to late 40s and the 1950s, you tell the story like the U.S. is kind of going at it with the Russians, basically engaging in its kind of active measures campaign. And then you say, really around the sort of early 1960s, CIA kind of, as you tell the story, kind of stops doing that, at least with regard to Russia, this East-West contest. And that's exactly the moment where the Russians sort of start ramping up. If anything, they increase their reliance. What if you could say a little bit about both why you think the US kind of stopped engaging in these disinformation measures, kind of what was the trigger for sort of pulling away from this? And then on the other hand, why it is you think Russia came to rely so much more heavily on these measures and sort of really ramped up their reliance on these tools in terms of the contest with the West?
Yeah. Paradoxically, it's easier to answer that question. Why did the Soviet Union escalate, and why did the West, or why did the United States de-escalate, to put it in a nutshell? It's easier to answer that question on the Soviet side than on the American side, for me at least right now, because some of the CIA operations that I'm describing in the book in the 1950s, especially the one that's codenamed LC Cassock in Berlin, was never discussed in the public domain or any research, historical research before, to my extraordinary surprise, because it had become online and declassified only so recently before I wrote the book. So there's not a lot of research on this question that you just raised. Why did CIA de-escalate and pull back? I have a few theories or hypotheses, but I can't say that I have high confidence in any of them. One of them would be that it just became, as in a big picture, as the intelligence community over the course of the 60s and 70s became more accountable, oversight mechanisms were created and improved in the United States. It just became harder to engage in covert action programs of that magnitude without them becoming public, or really also without them backfiring. Because CIA knew at the time, that we can say, that the Soviets knew about what they did. We know that actually because there were Soviet active measures that were directly responding to American political warfare that was covert. So there was really a secret battle going on that I don't think we understand very well to this day, and I'm touching only on parts of it in the book. So why did the Soviets escalate is an equally interesting question. And again, I'll provide sort of a bumper sticker level response, because ultimately disinformation is a weapon of authoritarian regimes. Disinformation and active measures is a tool that you can't excel at disinformation and democracy at the same time, to put it really bluntly. It has inherently anti-democratic features. Not all tactics and tools and methods in that toolbox, but most of them, I would think. And so it's no surprise that the US, really, as American democracy matured throughout the Cold War, was doing less of it, and the Soviet Union was doing more of it.
Is there also a way, I wonder, in which the sort of increasing asymmetry in terms of kind of hard power, in the sense of, capacity to project force around the world, fiscal strength, all these other features, there was a kind of growing divide between the West and the East, and in particularly Russia, which has kind of been in a long, slow decline. Is there a way in which some of these active measures are also kind of a weapon of the weak?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's not that expensive. You need a few people, but you can kind of create a lot of trouble for not all that much money, if you're willing to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there are multiple layers to your point there, actually. So, active measures were to the Soviet Union in the 80s what cyber operations are to the North Koreans today. It's something that gets you results at a relatively low cost and a low risk exposure level. And I would add another aspect to what you just said. It's a very well taken point, and that is, as we, the deterrence conversation in the context of nuclear weapons and also conventional forces in the late Cold War, also meant that covert action or active measures of that type, you could engage and even escalate below the level they were deniable, but still provided an outlet for ideological confrontation and even conflict. So it was really an evasive tactic in some ways. You couldn't deter it very easily.
Can you say more about Putin's role in all of this? So you describe in the book, and I found this really fascinating. I guess I had sort of understood it, but I didn't really understand it till reading your book, his kind of personal role in doubling down on this technique. So you describe his role in really kind of activating. This had been kind of going on for a really long time, but at least as I understand it, it really ramps up in the 90s and becomes a kind of key feature of this kind of contest with the West, and maybe, in part because of or after the fall of the Berlin Wall, this sort of challenge to the very being of obviously Soviet Union crumbles. yeah, so can you say a bit more about Putin's personal role in this, to the extent that we know about it, and kind of why it is he's, what role he's played in really escalating this use of active measures?
Yeah, so I thank you. That's a tough question to respond to. I should be straightforward about the limitations here of my book and the sources. I'm not really focusing on Putin's personal role in all this, because the sourcing there is problematic. It is really important to sort of appreciate, as we move from out of the Cold War and into the post-Cold War period, and then of course into the period where foreign active measures really escalate in the context of the Ukraine crisis, 2013, especially, but a little bit in the early 21st century. What we see there is a completely different set of sources that is available. We have high quality intelligence sources from many different archives up to the end of the Cold War. And then as we move forward, we're left with predominantly, digital forensics, the traces of operations that we see, a few anonymous sources, and of course American and other intelligence assessments of Russian operations, like indictments and intelligence assessments. And that is just a very unsatisfying set of sources, at least when you're used to the great archival material from the Cold War. So I think I can't overstate this point enough. It's a bit of an evasive response to your question, but we should really appreciate we should be so cautious and so humble when we make high confidence or assessments with confidence about any recent Russian operations, because we haven't seen any memos, we haven't seen any project files from them. Even the leaks that we have from GRU are, not that impressive in terms of the actual material that we've seen. I still have high confidence in some of the attribution on specific operations, but really one of the lessons of my book is there are a lot of deception operations going on, false flag operations where you try to blame somebody else for a covert action. And we shouldn't be surprised to see that happening today.
Yeah, that is, that's an excellent point, in that, maybe this is partially an answer to the question, why does the East escalate and why does the West de-escalate, is that, it's, as you say, it's very hard to get away with this stuff in the West these days. You've got a lot of nosy journalists. You've got a lot of people who, are willing to leak to the press. There are a lot of sources available. There's a lot of paper. There's a lot of paperwork involved in democracy and congressional oversight. Hard to do things that don't eventually get exposed. And the opposite is true, it seems, at least from the outside, of Russia. It's much more of a black box. They're much more capable of kind of keeping their secrets. The press is obviously famously repressed and doesn't have the same kind of access. So it's much more difficult to get that information. So that's a very fair point. So since this is the Yale Cyber Leadership Forum, we should turn to the cyber piece of this and talk a bit about how the rise of cyber changes, makes possible the expansion and increased use of active measures. Can you talk a bit about that? And this is the last portion of the book, really turns to this question of kind of now what happens when we have the capacity for digital active measures, hacking, dumping, election leaks, of course, you talk about. So can you say a bit about sort of how does the rise of cyber change this? Does it not really change it? Does it change it in any significant ways? What's your view of that?
Yeah. There are a couple of different features that the internet really is changing in active effects that the internet has on active measures, but they're not all as easy and as obvious as most people appear to think. So, for example, that culture of leaking information, I think, is a really important one. When I say culture of leaking, I mean a new form of activism that begins to emerge in the 1970s, a form of, in the context of the late Vietnam War, a form of activism that exposes Western intelligence operations and military operations, but predominantly intelligence operations, that ultimately matures and evolves into the WikiLeaks is an example of that.
Right.
But WikiLeaks wasn't a completely new thing. It just grew out of a form of activism that at that point was already well established. So the internet didn't completely change the game. It just added new platforms and technical possibilities in that leak cultural context, for example. And I would just, I always appreciate sort of ideas that run counter to established wisdom here, so people don't get bored. But look at the internet from an offensive point of view. Yes, it makes some aspects of active measures harder, but it also makes active measures in a way far more difficult to execute for a number of reasons. One of them is it's really hard to make a difference. I mean, there's so much noise out there. In the good old Cold War days, it's fairly easy to measure the effect of an operation, because once you had tricked a few journalists into covering an operation in a big way, that was your success story. But today, if you have a few fake accounts that push or try to amplify content, or you leak something on an obscure website and it doesn't get picked up, it's really hard to move the needle from an offensive point of view and make a big difference. We shouldn't be deceived by some of the big ticket operations that we overestimate, actually, and think they're, the new magic weapon in the quiver of weak actors. That is just a misreading of the facts. That's just one aspect here of how the internet has changed this game. Would you like me to name another one?
To what extent does the fact that you can get access to huge amounts of information without putting anybody physically at risk, right? So, I mean, this is maybe getting more into the espionage context, but a lot of this information is information that historically, to get sort of equivalent level information, you would have had to put sort of physical asset, you would have had put people at risk, sort of spy assets, at direct risk. And now you can just kind of, if you're diligent enough and you go after, and now, you send enough phishing emails and you're willing to kind of try and exploit these vulnerabilities, eventually you're going to hit on what is likely to be a really high volume of information without having to take any kind of direct risks. And then, I mean, the WikiLeaks maybe is mainly different just in terms of the massive volume that is involved, but also the 2016 election, lots of information. It's not just one email that leaks, but it's like a whole slew of stuff. Yeah. Is that one of the key differences, or is that not even all that different, or is it just the volume? Maybe that's not so much of an asset.
Yeah, thank you for prompting me to sort of finish that line of thought about WikiLeaks there, because what I said wasn't complete. By having these large volumes of files, access to large volumes of files remotely, and obviously the handing of information to WikiLeaks by multiple different entities, it appears, over the years, is an example of this. So what you have a new form of empowering activists, which is really a feature of active measures over the decades. They empower activists in your adversary, in your target society. And I would fully assume that, let's give Julian Assange the benefit of the doubt for a moment, although it's a thing that I don't do with ease, and say that he was unwitting. He didn't know that he was actually helping Russian intelligence by leaking certain files in 2016. Because that's ultimately, I would assume that they would not reveal their identity to him. Why should they do so? It's unprofessional to do that. So what's happening as a result is that a new form of activism will create value of an active measure in a way that was simply not possible before. Mm-hmm. To put it in different terms, in the 1980s, you really needed active measures to be artisanal, to have a lot of tradecraft built in. You needed to trick professional journalists sometimes in a way that really required a lot of work up front. But in 2016, say, or 2015, 2014, you didn't need to do that. You just put a lot of files into the public domain through some website, custom made, or WikiLeaks or something else, Cyber Guerrilla, for example. And what happened next is that third parties would go in, investigative journalists or activists, and pull out the interesting tidbits that would make an impact. So you outsource part of the value creation chain to the adversary, almost to the victim, not to the adversary, to the victim of an operation. That I think is an interesting new dynamic that we haven't really wrapped our head around.
I wonder to what extent part of the story here isn't also two other aspects that the internet opens up. So one is, so you said before, sort of active measures rely a great deal on kind of exposing or sort of pressing on unresolved contradictions. And I wonder if there's two aspects of the rise of the internet that we see. One is it's easier to detect these unresolved contradictions because all you need is access to a computer and you can get it. You don't even have to have some, a cultural mission within the country you just need to have access to the internet and you can find all these cultural contradictions. And maybe also the greater splintering of our discourse and maybe even like genuinely more of these unresolved contradictions coming to the surface because you have more of these kind of micro groups finding each other who have these kind of extreme views, who kind of feed one another and are just kind of waiting in a sense for someone to come along and kind of activate them. They don't know that that's what they're doing, but there's a way in which, these groups kind of existed all along, but now it's much easier for them to find each other. It's much, and it's much easier for them to be activated, I guess, in a sense. Like the active measures, they're much more vulnerable to that than, is there some truth to that this is part of the kind of the way in which the internet advent kind of, in a sense, soups up what has already been happening?
I think we shouldn't overestimate or we shouldn't underestimate how difficult it is to really get a fine-grained grasp on unresolved contradictions on these cultural features that you want to exploit. It really still probably requires some presence on the ground, maybe less so than in the past, but I think many of what I'm driving towards here is that many of the operations that we've seen in 2016, 2017, 2018 up to today are just so crude and easily discovered, both because they're actually often not very good, but also because they make so many operational security mistakes. Obviously, we're probably not seeing some of the better operations. I would clearly acknowledge that. But the risk here, and it's crucial in my mind to say this, and to emphasize this point, the big risk is that we overestimate the power of disinformation, the power of Russian darks and dark Russian entities operating in the shadows. We have a lot of the conversation on Russian active measures has entered the realm of fairy tale over the past few years, in my view, and it's no longer data driven, but ideology driven. Partisanship essentially has, to a significant extent, intruded into the conversation about Russian interference. For obvious reasons, we don't need to even to spell those out because it was an issue in the 2020 campaign. And that, of course, is hugely counterproductive for people like us who are interested in the facts and in history.
So tell me a bit, I mean, your book is in part, describing all of this and presumably to help us better understand what it is we're dealing with, and also to be able to kind of recognize and detect it and potentially respond to these active measures, because the active measures kind of lose their force. Not all of their force, but a lot of their force if you know that they're happening. If you recognize that the information that's being put out there is being put out there to manipulate you, you're maybe less likely to be manipulated. Can you say a bit about, what advice would you give about what we can do, in US government, but also individually, to try and sort of inoculate ourselves against or defend ourselves against active measures. And I should let the listeners know that we'll be turning to Q&A in a few minutes. So I see we already have a few questions, but if you have questions that you haven't yet had a chance to put into the Q&A, there's a button at the bottom, and please feel free to go ahead and write it in there. So what do we do about that? Like, how do we respond now that we better understand it? Like, what do we do?
You know, the view that an exposed measure is a dead measure, which you just articulated in a way, that was a Stasi sort of insight as well. That's how they ran. They thought, okay, once it's exposed, we have to drop it. It's no longer successful. I'm not sure that is still correct. In fact, you know, it's correct if you think people like us are the norm, people who care about a new fact. This was an active measure, for example, and then if your target group is investigative journalists, like it was for Stasi in a way, then of course that applies. But it no longer applies if you're operating in a highly partisan environment where a lot of people just don't care about facts. The factual itself is losing some of its meaning and authority. And especially if the institutions that are the guardians of the factual, scientists, investigators, law enforcement, journalists, experts, if you know, we lose some of our institutional authority, which I think is happening right now, then you can continue to run measures because people will they will continue to resonate. So I think the consequence must be that one exposure once doesn't do the trick. You have to expose again and again, and really you have to do the exposure itself in a way that resonates with emotions. It's kind of akin to convincing people that conspiracy theories are conspiracy theories. You can't just say, oh, this is conspiracy theory, here are the facts. You have to sort of get people to emotionally respond to what you're trying to say. I think it's such a fundamental. You really for people like us, Una, you and me, we are educators. You know, we have to appreciate the fine-tuned atmospherics in the classroom, that people need to feel comfortable to ask questions, to reveal what they don't know. It's not just about the facts, it's about human connection.
It's such an important point. And it's one of the things that I find so troubling about the moment that we find ourselves in, which is the evidence is pretty clear that lies take on this resonance, and actually an attempt to correct lies sometimes actually reinforces them in people's minds. And that you know, just correcting misinformation doesn't actually convince people of the truth necessarily. Sometimes it actually has the opposite effect because it's reinforcing to some degree this lie, and particularly where these conspiracy theories that are being spun are conspiracy theories that say all the authority figures are in on it. You know, the journalists are in on it. The government is in on it. You know, they're all lying to you. And so when they try to say, you know, when the journalists try to say, hey, you know, that conspiracy theory is a load of bunk, and here's the actual truth. And oh, by the way, it's, you know, it's an active measure from Russia, and you know, they're feeding this stuff to you. Nobody's, you know, a lot of the people who bought into these conspiracy theories are not persuaded. And it's part of what's so troubling, I think, because you at one point said disinformation and democracy can't coexist. And we're in that, I think we're in the middle of that deep fight between those kind of two forces, the disinformation and democracy.
Completely. And you know, that's, I think, why this anti-Semitism example from Germany in 1960 is so powerful, because we are in a comparable situation, not about anti-Semitism, but it's about the significance of facts and of institutions that are the guardians of facts. If we, in some ways it's irrelevant, not completely irrelevant, but it's not that important that some specific, take the Hunter Biden leaks. And the question whether Hunter Biden's laptop, whether there was some form of Russian role there. In some ways, that is a secondary question, because what this story is doing, it's exposing very deep emotional divisions and ideological divisions in our society. And if we simply point the finger at Russia and say, but Russia had a role here, perhaps, which we don't know for a fact, by the way, then we're just distracting from the fact that we have lost or are in the process of losing some of our ability to resolve domestic conflict peacefully by pointing to the truth, as opposed to by starting to fight against each other.
Yes, exactly. And that's that's what makes this so difficult, because active measures are kind of building on existing cleavages. And I think those cleavages maybe are stronger or greater than they've ever been. And our ability to shift people's perspective on these things feels really difficult. Like it feels like, and maybe it's partially because there's so much information out there, people don't know what to believe. You know, they don't want to, maybe they don't want to believe the sort of accurate information, and it puts people like us who are educators, who are, you know, I mean, we may not always 100% of the time get it right, but we're always really trying, and you know, we believe in truth, and we're trying to put the truth out there as best we understand it. And a world where that information, where truth no longer has the same kind of meaning, feels like an extremely dangerous place to be, and one where it's hard to see our democracy and our kind of democratic discourse surviving that, which makes the issue that you're raising here so crucial.
Yeah.
Is there any, like, if you could say to the Biden administration, like, if you're going to deal with this problem, like, here's what you should do. You know, if you like happen to show up in the room with President Biden and he says, okay, what do I do? I'm convinced this is a huge problem. You know, what initiatives would you say we ought to take to try and combat this set of problems that we're seeing become such a threat to our democracy?
I'm going to give you a very provocative answer to this question. There was this anecdote, this situation when Angela Merkel met with Vladimir Putin. I believe that must have been about 3, maybe 4 years ago. When, you know, Angela Merkel apparently has, she's not comfortable around large dogs. And there was the situation where Putin, he arranged for a dog to be present and sort of to come close to them to sort of say hi during a press conference or something silly.
Wow.
Obviously, just to put her in an uncomfortable position while she was sitting next to him with cameras in front of him. The kind of trickery that sort of falls into the wider box of dirty tricks that we're discussing here. And her reaction was so interesting afterwards, because she said essentially, you know, don't worry about it. That's all he has. Such a powerful thing to say in response. That's all he has. And in a way that applies to active measures. So that's all they got right now. I mean, look at Russia is in a deplorable state in so many ways. The provocations that we see are, you know, it seems to me a pretty desperate attempt to appear more powerful than they really are. So by responding in a way that is too, we have to be very mindful of not responding in a way that actually helps them to achieve that goal.
That's a really important point. All right, I think much as you and I could keep going for quite a bit longer, I'm going to turn it over to Ted, because I can see we're already up to quite a number of questions, probably more than we're going to manage to get through. But that's great. So
that's
over to you,
true.
Ted.
Well, this has been great. I muted my video so I could take notes and focus on this great conversation. And thank you so much, Ona and Thomas. We were headed in a direction towards potential solutions or policy areas of focus to counter disinformation. Thomas, you know, one question we have here is about the responsibility of big tech. We did have Nathaniel Gleischer from Facebook on talking about election interference a few weeks back in the forum. You know, what is your sense of how Facebook and other social media companies are taking or not taking responsibility for disinformation on their platforms? Are they, you know, being as diligent as they can in focusing on this? Do we need a stronger regulatory or liability regime in this regard?
Yeah, that's a super tough question. And the answer, there's no wholesale answer to this question, because different social media companies are reacting so differently. And also individual companies have really, some of them have really stepped up to the plate. Like Twitter initially was really dragging its feet, but then at some point tried to turn this around and become more transparent and forward leaning. And I think they're doing a fantastic, far better job now than they did in the past. Facebook is getting a lot of criticism in the wider public, obviously. But again, Facebook has invested more than any other social media company in countering these operations. It's taking them down at a fast clip. And not just disinformation operations, but Facebook has only recently decided to be more proactive in taking down espionage operations against minorities on their platform. Because Facebook is mainly serving individuals and not companies with their services, you tend to see more minority, like Uyghurs targeting, for example, authoritarian regimes going after their own citizens or diasporas on their platform. And so I think, I have, contrary to what a lot of people usually think, I think I have mainly positive things to say about Facebook, although I don't use their product, actually. But I have fairly negative things to say about Google, although I use their product all the time. And so, for example, not Gmail security, but YouTube. I don't think YouTube has, has pulled its weight in terms of countering disinformation on its platform. Not nearly enough. They, in fact, facilitated and still facilitate the spread of conspiracy theory to an extent that is hugely harmful to American democracy.
Thank you for that. And just turning now then to sort of the government side of what to do. We have had a bunch of forums looking at cyber organization strategy, mostly focused on, I would say, the cybersecurity of critical infrastructure and not disinformation. So we have a student question here that's asking us to sort of, how do government agencies need to rethink disinformation? I mean, do we need a sort of single entity in charge? I mean, is your sense that this is something that like DHS CISA needs to own, or the National Cyber Director, or is this a whole of government? Everyone needs to internalize the risk, and we shouldn't sort of be reorganizing on disinformation, similar to how we have reorganized, for instance, on offensive cyber operations.
Yeah, I don't think, intuitively, I don't think that organizing counter influence operations, counteractive measures, counter disinformation in one position somewhere is helpful at all. Actually, it's probably might be counterproductive. In fact, I would reframe the question and say, if you look at how disinformation research is done and conducted and perceived inside the wider threat intelligence community, then I think what we need is more integration throughout the entire field. There is no clear distinction oftentimes between influence operations and espionage, because one turns into the other. So as the most sophisticated adversaries are engaged in multi-team efforts, their offenses are done by multiple teams working together, cutting across artificial distinctions. We should do the same on the defense, but not by creating more artificial divisions, but instead trying to bridge them in the research community.
Thank you. And in terms of sort of countering disinformation, or as you're talking about conspiracy theories, trying to persuade people in the opposite, or to come back to reality. We have a good question from a student about this. I mean, maybe can you direct us to any thoughts or research about, how do we bring people back into the fold if they have these hardened perceptions, or are the victims, so to speak, of disinformation or influence operations?
Yeah, it's a tough question, because it really presupposes that influence operations have succeeded in isolating people in their own conspiracy theory dominated worldviews. I would actually take issue with that baseline assumption. I'm not familiar with, I've hinted at that before, but let me just make it more explicit. We are vastly overestimating the impact of the 2016 election interference operation. There's no doubt in my mind that we just have to do some revisionism here. 2016, Trump was legitimate. Trump was elected fair and square, just like Biden was elected fair and square in 2020. Both theories that the presidents each time were not elected fair and square, that is a conspiracy theory in my view. And that's based on a sober analysis of the facts, I think. And so bottom line is, if you want to understand how to pull people out of conspiracy theories, that, of course, is an interesting conversation. And the one resource that I would recommend to you here, which will keep you busy many, many hours, is the QAA, the QAnon Anonymous podcast,
Yep.
which is a fantastic resource.
Great. That'll be very helpful to a lot of our students who are interested in this. So we have another question about the migration or the proliferation of disinformation or influence operations techniques from sophisticated state actors like Russia, which of course is the focus of your book. But similar to how offensive cyber tools proliferate, in the disinformation space, could you see non-state groups or private sector entities or other groupings sort of grasping influence operations as a tool of tradecraft? And are there some examples or areas of concern that you have in this area?
Yeah, because there are so many people out there who overstate the significance and impact of information operations today. That is creating a market. It's essentially a constructivist nightmare. You think that something is more successful than it actually is, so you do more of it, and therefore sometimes make it more successful than it actually is or should be. And what we see indeed is it appears that more and more actors are entering this game, and I would refer to the recent intelligence assessment that Avril Haines, the ODNI, made public a couple of weeks ago. And you clearly see that multiple actors are trying their luck in active measures today. So yes, that is happening.
Thank you. We've talked a lot about Russia. We do have a question about other countries, primarily China and Iran in the disinformation space. China and their influence operations were a focus indeed of the recent DNI threat assessment that was public. If you look at China, for instance, how would you evaluate their foray into the disinformation influence space, particularly as it pertains, to COVID issues? How would you compare that to the Russia case study that you've delved into in such detail?
So the China COVID exploit, the Chinese attempts to exploit COVID. That's a super difficult question because we still don't have the good sourcing, and I would almost like to dodge that question because I haven't delved into the depth of what sources are reliable and what not, and there's still that open question out there whether the even just asking the question can be misunderstood, but whether the Wuhan lab, whether a lab accident in Wuhan is a thinkable explanation or not, and there's been some really impressive investigative journalism on that question recently. But there are too many open questions there, but certainly China is trying to shift the blame. That much is obvious.
But maybe at a higher level of sort of strategic thinking, do you think, or do you perceive the Chinese system and their security apparatus to have embraced disinformation or their version of active measures in a way similar to Russia? Or do you think that that's sort of unique to the Russian strategic context and history in this area?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think historically, there are remarkably few solid disinformation active measures case studies that involve China in the Cold War. So the Chinese history in this space it appears to me quite different very sharply different from the Soviet history, despite the common communist history there. But of course, what we see today is a form of influence. The Chinese influence operations are much more, in some ways, insidious, much more cautious, also more focused on Chinese interests, including business interests, and less reliant on straight up forgeries and lies than what we historically see from the Russian Federation.
Thank you. We have a question from one of our Yale Law School students, Randy Michelle, about how foreign actors are increasingly leveraging domestic actors to spread disinformation. And this was something that, again, in the earlier Cyber Forum sessions we had on with Facebook colleagues, that they were emphasizing it as a problem. So how do you sort of view or maybe do you view disinformation challenge differently when it's coming from domestic versus foreign actors? I mean, you run into a number of First Amendment issues here, free speech rights. You know, how have you thought about this question?
The question is the question about foreign actors influencing domestic conspiracy theories?
It's about the root. It's about how you can leverage domestic actors to spread disinformation. And so is there a way that you think we can better coordinate this question on the domestic end of countering disinformation, or does it have to be sort of countering the foreign influence aspect of it?
Yeah. Again, let me provoke.
We want you to provoke. We know that's, yeah, please.
In Russia, Russia has embraced today, the Russian Federation, the Russian government has embraced, a lot of people in Russia actually have embraced what we might call the remote control theory. Some of the velvet revolutions are remotely controlled by the devious Americans. Some, American or NGOs in Russia, Medusa, media organization, was recently declared a foreign agent. The Atlantic Council is facing problems in Russia. Carnegie to a lesser extent. So the assumption that domestic problems are remotely controlled, that is a temptation and a worldview that is not unique to, but it's common in authoritarian regimes. You can almost say, sort of bumper sticker level, the more a political culture assumes that its own problems are created from the outside by remote control, the more undemocratic it is. You see where this is going. We see that theory taking root in the United States. And we see it taking root in the United States, not so much on the right. We see it taking root on the center left as well. Actually, predominantly, that some of our domestic problems are caused by foreign interference. Sometimes they might be to an extent, but really, if we look closely, it's a very small extent. That's, again, why the German anti-Semitism case study is so powerful, because Germany decided very quickly, and rightly so, because of its recent experience, completely going to ignore the possibility of foreign interference here, because it's beside the point. We actually have a problem here, and we need to fix that problem, so let's fix it. Let's not blame our domestic problems on foreign interference, because that makes us look like Russia.
We have a number of questions here, Thomas, about international cooperation on disinformation. And we've had some sessions in the forum on cyber diplomacy. Is this an area where you could see greater coordination between, first of all, within the EU countries, but maybe between United States and European countries? Or the Biden administration has, of course, emphasized sort of global cooperation among democracies to counter authoritarianism, of which disinformation is a key tool, as you note. Is this something that you think could potentially be effective, and how might that play out in your mind?
On an optimistic day, I would actually think that COVID, in some weird way, has offered us an opportunity, on a society level, even internationally. Obviously, it's a global problem, to really appreciate the value of science and a fact-based approach. And a lot of people now, more than ever, again, this is me trying to be optimistic as hard as I can, more people than ever understand what clinical trials are that science works by readjusting its findings based on new trials, new data that is coming available. And I think there's a little, there's hope and opportunity in there, that a lot of people are now, more people than ever, following science news. I mean, part of me is very optimistic as a result. So I think there is value in really emphasizing the extraordinary potential that scientific progress has achieved over the past couple of months. I mean, look at, it's a miracle. I'm sure you do the same. We are now having physical meetings again, and I mean, they're picking up at a quick pace. It's an extraordinary achievement. really amazing. We should take a step back and just open our mouth in awe sometimes. That's how cool this is.
Yeah. Just on COVID, there were also just a few questions about disinformation and COVID. You touched on this with respect to China, but do you see this as magnifying now going forward, even greater level, what the sort of disinformation capabilities may be of other countries on the world stage? Or do you think COVID is just sort of already highlighting what we've known about how other countries are starting to view this threat?
I think it's too early to say. If you write a history book, I'm sure some of you will empathize here. You'll see the fog rising in your field of vision the closer you come to the present. 2016 is still very difficult to assess because it's too close and emotionally charged. I mean, obviously, COVID is so close that I don't dare make any predictions yet because we're in the thick of it still.
Yep. So we have another question here that's about misinformation and disinformation and sort of the challenge of characterizing possibly opinions, beliefs, or ideology as opposed to something that is deliberately trying to deceive. We've had some sessions on data governance, talking about the role that tech companies are increasingly playing on making these sort of true, false determinations in the misinformation, disinformation space. What is your sense of sort of what the right way is to try to sort out, differences of opinion versus disinformation? Is this a technical challenge as much as it's a psychological or a subjective one? What's the right way to try to grapple with this?
Yeah, I think, we earlier, in response to Una's first question, I said disinformation is such a fuzzy and difficult term. And I think this question just illustrates that again. A lot of the question, I think, really is about conspiracy cults and the conspiracy theory, not disinformation. Because the responses to, January 6th by the social media companies, it appears to me, is what motivated this question. And of course, they're also, we're in the middle of this conversation. I think, bizarrely, being a German really has equipped me fairly well to deal with this historically. I mean, to deal with this disinformation problem, because also there's in Germany, incitement to violence is illegal. So we have to have that conversation about the First Amendment, I think, in this country, about when incitement to violence, which clearly has happened and continues to happen in ways that are not democratically acceptable for a democracy, when social media companies should take down content, not because it's false or not, that I think is, again, a misleading question, but because it leads to political consequences that are undemocratic.
And do you see disinformation getting more sophisticated with the rise of AI and machine learning techniques? Is this a significant concern in your view that you could either automate disinformation or highly sophisticate or tailor it to particularly segmented audiences?
Yeah, there's a lot. That question always gets asked. I think there's some research coming out soon where research teams have applied advanced machine AI solutions to the question of bots. I mean, to essentially mimic human communication online. And to be blunt, I'm not that impressed by the results. I think we're in a phase of extraordinary hype on the whole AI and machine learning side. The two features that help where machine learning is usually giving you a great advantage is speed and scalability. Those two features are actually not helpful here, because if you speed up or scale certain operations on social media platforms, for example, that makes you easily discoverable, and you can be taken down as a result. I just haven't seen any good evidence that would convince me to believe that social media, that AI is in any way a game changer.
We do have a lot of questions about the QAnon conspiracy. We've already touched on it, but maybe you could say a little bit more here. So we have a question here that's sort of speculating. How do I sound now, Thomas?
Sorry. Yeah, sorry, I missed. My car took over my speakers for a second. I apologize. Could you say that again?
No need to apologize. We're all doing the best we can in this format. But so we do have a lot of questions about the QAnon conspiracy, and we've already touched on it a little bit. This is a question that's saying, it seems to me that if Q was a foreign agent and the movement was an influence operation, it would be one of the most successful in history. But even if it's not, it's still even more concerning just if this is just a person or just some guy, right? And so I just was wondering if you could just reflect a little bit on the significance or insignificance of QAnon. You know, has it changed or magnified any of your reflections about active measures or the impact of active measures or disinformation, or is this sort of a uniquely American conspiracy theory in your view?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I understand the temptation to try to blame everything on foreign interference. But I admit I am surprised by the persistence with which this question comes up. I mean, it seems obvious that QAnon is not just an American phenomenon, but a global phenomenon, predominantly American. I mean, you could somewhat snarkily observe that American cultural hegemony seems to work fairly well when it comes to far-right conspiracy theories, because they are pushed out to Europe in a pretty impressive way here too. But QAnon, I mean, obviously it's an extraordinary phenomenon. I'm teaching several sessions of my disinformation class on QAnon, not because it has any foreign link, but just because it's so fascinating to understand why so many people would fall for it. What I would say here, there's a great article that I would recommend to anybody interested in QAnon. It's called a gamer's analysis of QAnon, published on Medium. And it just makes you understand how Q drops actually work. They're almost like gaming devices that. And from an educational, it's also a great read for any educator, because let's face it, Q is actually really an impressive educator, not educating anything meaningful in terms of facts, but the fact that so many people bought into this makes us all a little jealous who teach in a way. So it's really helpful to study the finer mechanics of how this works. And if you zoom in and study it, none of it leads you into the terrain that it could be a foreign intelligence operation in any way.
Thank you for that. I was writing down this the article because I want to make sure that our students can also see it. So we have a few other questions about sort of U.S. directed, what you might call disinformation or influence, or their own active measures. And of course, you cover some of this in your book from the Cold War period. And it seems like the United States has sort of moved away from this as a tool of foreign policy, in the post-Cold War era. But authoritarian regimes themselves are uniquely vulnerable to not disinformation, but information, right? So truthful information about their misrule. Is this the sort of activity that you think could, as a tool of the United States or other countries, could be either a deterrent to disinformation from Russia or China or other malicious actors in this space, or is that just a slippery slope that will magnify this challenge even worse?
We have this habit that we think things have to be completely new to be remarkable, which obviously is silly. Let's be direct and make an example. Just 2 weeks ago, approximately 2 weeks ago, The New Yorker published this extraordinary piece by Rafi Kachdurian about a woman who was interned in one of Xinjiang province's internment concentration camps. Let's not mince words here. And it's a truly shocking piece to read what happened to her. I highly recommend it to anybody. It's more meaningful than anything that I've said. in the past hour. And it's, it's the truth. It's happening. We are looking at the country that, every day you get an Amazon delivery and you open a packet and it says made in China. That country is running major concentration camps that are simply disgusting. So exposing that is, is that an information operation or an active measure? Of course not. It's just simply reporting out the truth, and we should do more of it.
So you think there's more you could learn? For example, we have a question about sort of, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, are these the sorts of activities that you could envision the United States or allied countries, investing more heavily in and ramping up as a way to, flood the information space with accurate portrayals of some of these areas?
Sometimes, I take your point, and the point of the question was about flooding the information space. But when I sometimes read what people in the Department of Defense put out when it comes to information warfare or psychological operations, it sounds so weird, because in a way, American journalists are already doing it and doing it pretty well. I know this means I'll probably sound quaint when I say this, but some of the amazing investigative work that is done on what happens in Russia, in fact, by a lot of Russian journalists. One of the major differences between China and Russia is that actually there's a fairly impressive group of investigative independent journalists still left in Moscow and Russia writ large that bring out and report out extraordinary facts, hugely embarrassing to the intelligence community and Putin himself. So, let's celebrate them and not talk about the sort of the securitized language of dominating the information space. They are already doing that. Look at Bellingcat. What Bellingcat has reported out and revealed, it's just absolutely extraordinary in comparison to many intelligence that try to counter Russian operations.
Yeah, that's a great example. All right, well, we've gotten through a lot of the questions here. We are reaching the end of our time. I want to kick it back to Ona for any final thoughts, and thanking you, Thomas, as well as wrapping up what's been a marathon 7-part semester.
Yeah, so I just want to end by saying thank you so much, Thomas, for rounding us out. I wish we had you here in person, but this is the second best. And just again, really recommend everyone to pick up this book. It's a great read, and I think will give you a lot of depth behind the conversation that we've just had. I also want to round us out, since this is our last session, by saying thank you so much to you, Ted, for being my partner in crime on this. It's been great to work with you on this. Thank you to Jennifer Zuccaro, who has been the brains behind the operation and kind of getting us all organized. I'm really grateful to her for her hard work. Thanks to the Jackson Institute, which has been partnering with the law school at Yale to carry out this series. We put on this conference on a regular basis together. It's always a highlight of the year. And I really appreciate that partnership. And thank you to all of our students and participants. It's been great to have you all here. I'm sorry we haven't been able to see your faces, but we look forward to being back in person soon, so we can see all of you in person and return to holding this conference, the Yale Cyber Leadership Forum, in person. For those interested in attending or applying to participate, keep an eye on our website, because we'll be providing information as we make decisions about when we can again return in person, and we hope that will be soon. So thank you, everyone. Thank you so much, Thomas, for ending us on such a great note, and thanks to everyone for being here with us. We look forward to seeing you all back in person before too long, thanks to, as Thomas rightly pointed out, the great scientific success of the vaccine. So thanks, everyone.
Be well. Thank you, Thomas. Take care.
Thanks, Thomas.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you so much.